UN attempts to unify Korea began in 1947 when they held voting elections. Soviet Russia blocked the elections in the north and backed their own candidate to take over North Korea. His name was Kim Il-sung. The South elected US-backed Rae Syngman. Both men were nationalists. Both talked openly about reuniting Korea by force. Soviet Russia backed a militaristic state. The US, wary of further conflict in the Pacific, created a democratic state overseen by General MacArthur from Japan. To keep Rae Syngman from invading the North, the U.S. limited the South Korean Army's weapons and training. In 1949, under UN mandate, the U.S. and Soviet military forces withdrew from Korea. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950. Armed with former Soviet tanks and weapons, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. It is considered the first of a long series of military actions that became known collectively as the Cold War. How Korea became divided, and what led to this devastating war, began during World War II. After it became clear to the Allied powers that the Japanese Empire was losing, they held a number of summit meetings. During these meetings, they decided who was to occupy former Japanese colonies, Korea being one, and for how long. The goal was to make these colonies independent once again, not rule over them. It was decided that for Korea, everything north of the 38th parallel would be overseen by Soviet Russia, and everything south was overseen by the United States. This resulted in many families, even entire villages, being separated. Korea was divided by Allied powers, and then its first elections were influenced heavily by foreign intervention. This explains why there was a North and South Korea, but why did so many heavy players become involved in the war? Geologically, Korea is a peninsula that sits as an outcrop from the Chinese mainland, west of the Japanese islands. It is mostly bordered by China, to the north, but a small amount borders Russia also. Korea, like other smaller nations, has a long history of being bullied by its neighbors. Despite this, her people have maintained an independent culture and language. During the 1950s, East and West relations were tense at best. The United States took North Korea's aggression as an advance of communism against the free world. By September of 1950, South Korea was all but conquered. UN forces, led by the US, were sent to rectify the situation. They pushed the People's Army back north, almost to China. Fearing it may be invaded next, China flooded troops and vehicles south to stop the advancing forces. One soldier, making up the US ranks, making their initial push north, was John Joe Barrett. He served in the Korean War, and his daughter, Bernadette, recalls her mother's and father's early years in America.
My mom came to America, to Chicago, in the late 1940s, and my father followed on. He first immigrated from Ireland to England, and then he came to Chicago. So it would have been the late 40s. They had a good life. Mom had a lovely job, and she also learned to drive here, and she went to school here, and and she really enjoyed life here. Our two oldest children were born here, and Dad worked as a carpenter when he came first, and then he was drafted to the army during the Korean War. They were married on 1951, on November 17th, here in Chicago, in St. Catherine's Catholic Church in the south side of Chicago. He was drafted to the war, which was it was compulsory. You had to go. So he went in as a soldier, and he was promoted to a sergeant, and he was overseer for the building of the bridges. I don't know that he ever hit the front line, but during his time there, he was in charge of bridge building, and he had a gentle rapport. He was not at all into war, and he he got on very well with the locals, and he was actually recognized as Sergeant of the Month one time. But he had no problem allowing the locals to sing as they worked, and this was something I guess they liked to do. They would have a chant going, whereas some of his fellow mates would not allow this. And one thing he did mention during his time was that he was disappointed with the behaviour of some of his fellow officers towards locals. We were in a foreign country after all, and they were the local people. So he was disappointed with their lack of respect for them. But the fact that he would let them sing as they worked improved their production, and things were finished fast. He won an award for that, yes. He had to serve his time, and he was dismissed as soon as the war was finished. Then he returned to Chicago, and then they returned to Ireland shortly after that. I'm not sure if it was a health issue or if he was just disheartened with having to have been at war.
Dubbed the Forgotten War, John Joe was not the only one to put the bad memories behind him. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described the war as the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong people. Over 36,000 Americans, 415,000 South Koreans, and close to 1.5 million North Koreans and Chinese gave their lives. The U.S. spent about $67 billion on the war. Considered a stalemate, the war did not resolve anything. No peace treaty was ever signed. Peace is managed by a ceasefire enacted in 1953. A strongly militarized DMZ, demilitarized zone, has been established along the 38th parallel, where North and South Korean soldiers patrol at this very instant.